Hey! Are you here? Are you here? Look, if you aren't here, what's the point in starting the episode? Think about it. This is the Paul Leslie Hour, now in our 19th year. And on today's show, we're continuing our exploration of singer-songwriter Bob Dylan's new book, The Philosophy of Modern Song, published by Simon Schuster. Today is another book talk. Our guest on this episode, taped November 2nd, 2022, is with a downright gifted and knowledgeable person. Jeff Slate is his name, and he's qualified to talk Bob Dylan. Jeff's a singer-songwriter, music journalist, a rock historian, and radio personality. You seriously need to check out his stuff. Jeff Slate. Now, Jeff Slate is passionate about great music of all kinds. Here are some interesting tidbits. Slate wrote the liner notes to the Bob Dylan bootleg release, Mo Blood, Mo Tracks. Jeff also wrote great pieces about Dylan for the New Yorker and Esquire. His specialized expertise in the Dylan world has been noted, but he's also written about the Beatles, Roy Orbison, the Rolling Stones, and others. Now, you're going to love Jeff Slate's insight into the new Dylan book, The Philosophy of Modern Song. Paul can't wait for you to listen. You know, it's worth mentioning that we're trying our best to double the audience on our YouTube channel before we hit the 20-year mark. Yeah, it's free, and it's fast. Won't you please click that button that says subscribe? Thank you. Oh, you can also help us in our mission to help people tell their stories. Simply visit www.thepaulleslie.com/support. And we thank you wholeheartedly. Jeff Slate, come forth. It's time to start another show.
Sounds great.
A freewheeling conversation.
Freewheeling. There you go. All right. I'm ready when you are.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be joined by Jeff Slate. I think he's a multifaceted individual, a singer-songwriter from New York City. He's also a critic, a journalist. He's written for everything from Rolling Stone magazine, The New Yorker, Wall Street Journal, could keep on listening. Also a Sirius XM personality. He's written liner notes for everyone from Bob Dylan to the Rolling Stones. Quite a list of accomplishments, and we're honored to have him here to talk about the new book from Bob Dylan, which you can kind of see in the corner of my shoulder there, The Philosophy of Modern Song. So, Jeff, how are you?
I'm great. I've read the book twice now, so I'm happy to talk about it.
Read the book twice. All right. So, based on that, could we assume that you enjoyed it?
I did. I had to read it. I got it a little bit early, and I had to read it kind of in a mad dash because I was going to have to working on a project around it, and so I didn't. I was making notes, and I was kind of annotating my copy, and all that stuff, but it wasn't read for enjoyment. Mm-hmm. So over the weekend I read it more for enjoyment, and I thought that was a better way to do it.
It's true. There's the review, and then there's the chance to kind of absorb and enjoy. Now, you just to tell all the viewers and listeners out there, you just said that you were listening to the Theme Time Radio Hour with your host, Bob Dylan. Is there a connection between that and having just read the book twice?
It certainly, there's something about it that certainly reminds me of Theme Time Radio Hour. It's certainly an extension or a sequel, or it's in the same Bob Dylan universe, that's for sure. The way he writes is very similar to the way he talks as a host or DJ or whatever you want to call it in Theme Time Radio Hour. And the song choices are similar. They're all over the place. They're stylistically, they draw largely from, when he was a teenager, and also with kind of, left turns and right turns to his preteen years or, later in the 20th century. So, I think they're all, a lot of things in Bob Dylan's life and career seem to be on a continuum. It's just that it's not obvious until much later. This is fairly straightforward that it's related to Theme Time Radio. I was listening to the Halloween podcast or a Halloween episode because I didn't get a chance to on Halloween. I sent it to my kids and some friends. But I had an hour to kill before we were going to talk. So I put on Bob.
Was the book all you expected?
I didn't have any expectation. Once, the title didn't give much away. It's a very highfalutin title, but I think that's with Bob, everything is sometimes it's either, total reality or completely tongue in cheek or a little bit of both. This is a little bit of both, I think. But then I saw, like everybody else, the song list. And I thought, I immediately made that connection we were just talking about to Theme Time Radio Hour, that it was all over the map stylistically, that it was, it mirrored probably what we think Bob Dylan's record collection is something like, or what he likes to listen to, both as a guy who devours popular culture as well as somebody who's a real music lover. I think we can all agree on that. But then, once you sit down with it and there's no introduction, nothing. You're right in with Detroit City. So it's, I think pretty quickly I figured out, like everybody else, what the pattern was going to be. He was going to riff on the song, he was going to riff on the writer, and then he was going to kind of sum it up with his Bobness, his thoughts. And I love that format. He doesn't stick to it strictly throughout. But I love that format. And, once you get that, it's a book, you can certainly read it cover to cover, but I think you can read it if, you want to listen to that record, you can just pull out that one, you can stick it in the bathroom and just read a chapter or a song a day, or maybe put a couple of songs on while you're in the shower and read it before while you're on the John. I think there's a lot of ways to approach this, the book, and not all of them are, and most of them are not all that precious, which I think is probably the best way to take it.
As a songwriter yourself, what did you think about the songs? It was everything from country, Western, goodness, Mac the Knife, Beyond the Sea, really is a great variety of stuff. Yeah.
Any book that has, like I said, Detroit City and Pancho and Lefty and, everything in between, London Calling and Pump It Up, is a strange and fantastic book in and of itself. That it's written by Bob Dylan is great. I think what I'll take away from it as a songwriter is maybe yet to be seen. I didn't read it. I didn't read it for pointers. There's everything and nothing to be learned by Bob Dylan. I could never aspire to be that kind of songwriter or that kind of storyteller. He's a whole other level of songwriter. But I think there's little clues in the way he writes and his observations about each song for anybody who's a writer of any kind, or even just as a conversationalist. The things he focuses on in those are they're not really what you would focus on. I've used this example many times, but I think my buddy Bill Flanagan interviewed him maybe 15 years ago or so when one of his albums came out, And, he asked him about, I think it was outside his hotel room window, there were train tracks. And Bob wanted to talk not about the train tracks, but about the dog by the train tracks. And it was a 3-legged dog. And that was more interesting to him than the train tracks. And I think that's what's unique about him and his perspective of songwriting. The nuts and bolts are there. The performances are talked about, a little bit of the history and what the song meant within popular culture. But some of his, he uses this sort of scat, free association way of writing about the songs that are impressionistic, that give away a lot of what he took from. It's not maybe what I would take, and it's not maybe what anybody would take. It's what Bob would take. And I think those are the clues to sort of the way he sees the world that can help anybody who's writing anything look beyond the obvious. It's a long way to answer a short question. Sorry.
No, it was very good stuff. Well, I'm curious because we have so many people who are our listeners or viewers out there who they are songwriters themselves. Do you think that this book could help them in their quest as a songwriter?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think as a songwriter, read everything, and I think don't read songs about songwriting. I mean, don't read books about songwriting. Write songs. That's my advice. And I'm certainly I'm not an A-level guy or anything, but I think in my experience, it's even when there's not inspiration, to just write for the pure craftsmanship of it, to try to, give yourself a task. I'm going to write a song about Halloween today. Or John Lennon said in one of his last interviews, if you told me you needed a song for a movie about a banana, I could write you a song about a banana. Might not be the greatest song in the world, but I could do it because I'm a craftsman and that's what I do. I think anything that flexes your creative muscle is good. I think with regard to this book, I think there's so many different things you can take from it. You can certainly look at the songs he's elevated by including them in the book and say to yourself, make yourself a playlist. Or, I shared one recently on Twitter that had all the songs, and though not all Bob's versions. And you could just listen, and see, like, read the book and listen to the songs and sort of see, what do I take from the structure and the rules they adhere to and the rules they break, and what's great about, what changes the song in the performance. Sometimes the songs can be not great songs, but they're elevated by the performance, or by the person interpreting them. Some of the songs Frank Sinatra recorded weren't the greatest songs in the world, but he elevated them with sort of the polish he put on them with his voice and his phrasing and all of that. So I think there's that's a roundabout way of answering your question. I think the short version is, read the book and take of it, what you will. Everybody wants to like pin Bob down, and I like to take my Bob Dylan the way he presents himself. I don't want to read a biography. I don't want to know what he ate for breakfast. I don't want to know where he was on August 13th. If he wants me to read this book, I'm going to read this book, and I'm going to, impart, I think, get some wisdom that he's imparted, and that may evolve over time too. So I think that's the key thing. Sort of don't sit with it once, maybe read it now and read it again in a year, and you may have a completely different take on what he gave you.
Interesting. Now, was there any song you mentioned right off the bat, Detroit City, which is one of my favorite songs, but was there any song that in particular stood out to you in some way?
Well, look, I mean, that's a really difficult question. You're not the first person to ask me that, because there's so many eras and so many genres dealt with. I thought it was interesting who didn't get included. He included a couple of Little Richard, but no Chuck Berry.
Right.
For my money, Chuck is much closer to Bob Dylan than Little Richard. but clearly Bob, because he came of age and idolized Little Richard, identifies more with Little Richard than he does Chuck Berry, at least for the purposes of this book. Who knows? But that he included two Little Richard songs was really like a thrill to me, because I discovered Little Richard as a very young guy, and he was one of the people who was really like a god to me as a young guy, even before I was a musician, and then certainly as a musician, because he was just doing it completely his own way, in his own way. Like he was unlike anybody else. And I think a lot of the people in this book are that. So the Richard songs were important to me. I love that he included London Calling. It's not the Clash song I would have picked, but it's certainly a song Bob Dylan is familiar with. He's went to a bunch of Clash concerts because Jacob was a fan when Jacob was a kid, when they were still around. So he was exposed to them when they were really at their peak as a band. So it's interesting, like I can think of 5 other, maybe 10 or more Clash songs that might better, you would think would be Bob's favorites, but he picked London Calling. Why did he pick London Calling? And it's again, a lot of times with these songs, it's the imagery and the wordplay, the literacy of these songs is what, they've all got great melodies. They've all got great performances. But the literacy of those things, of the songs individually, he does the same thing with Pump It Up. The way he scats over, his impressions of what Elvis Costello is saying as a singer and a songwriter. It's the same with the Clash. It's an amazing thing. And so those stood out to me because they're songs that are near and dear to me. But then there were songs that I didn't know all that well, that I had certainly heard over the course of my life, but I went back and I kind of re-examined them through the lens of this book. And I think that's what's really cool about it is, there are songs that were, kind of not throwaway songs, but there are some songs in here that are, for want of a better way of saying it, novelty songs. And they're elevated by what he writes about them. And when you go back and hear them, you hear them with new ears, I think. And that was really cool.
Something that you're touching on is I think really interesting. And that is, I had Alan Light on, and
good pal.
What's that?
Alan's a good pal. Yeah.
He was saying that kind of similar to what you were saying, in that, there's a lot of people that he's like, if you look at Bill Flanagan again, the people he named, you don't see, like, there's no Gordon Lightfoot song in here. There's no Joni Mitchell. There's no
Joan Baez.
Right. It's kind of interesting that I figured, well, eventually we'll get to, If You Could Read My Mind or something by Lightfoot, but no.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people are going on and on about how there are 66 songs. 66 songs isn't that many songs.
Right.
I mean, think of how many songs Bob Dylan's probably heard and loved in his lifetime. Right. You certainly can't include them all. And again, if you're going to include, what I loved about the book was there wasn't a lot of overlap in the styles or the style of performance. In other words, if you get into, in other words, you wouldn't want it to be a book that's just great singer-songwriter tunes, because it would just be, it'd be Jackson Browne and Leonard Cohen and Joni Mitchell and Gordon Lightfoot, and then it would be very genre specific, right? Whereas here, he picked representative tunes, in my mind, it seems, representative tunes that were significant to him, or that at the moment he just felt strongly about. Like he included Warren Zevon rather than, like I said, Leonard Cohen or Neil Young or Gordon Lightfoot. And I think that's a cool choice, because everybody knows Bob Dylan's connection to Gordon Lightfoot and Gordon Lightfoot's songs. Certainly right now in our generation. But they might not be so aware that he was a big Warren Zevon fan.
Right.
And I think so. And Warren's catalog deserves to be reheard and reassessed and thought about, especially by younger singer-songwriters and younger Bob Dylan acolytes. So I think, Bob's always the trickster. He's playing a little sleight of hand here. I think, he made representative choices, and I think that's probably what he was trying to do there. But God knows I can't read Bob Dylan's mind.
Well, speaking of not being able to read his mind, you're going to think probably this is a very speculative question, but why do you think he wrote this book? What do you think the motivation was?
Wow, I couldn't even begin to guess. The thing that I loved about Theme Time Radio Hour, and the thing that I love about this book, is they're fun.
Mm.
Many people think of Bob Dylan as a very serious kind of sour guy. He doesn't talk much in concert. He doesn't give a lot of interviews. A lot of his humor is ironic or tongue in cheek. It's not to everybody's, not everybody gets the references, when he makes jokes. But I'll tell you, I met Tom Petty many years ago, and we had a long conversation about Bob. And I didn't think I would ever see Tom again. And I was lucky enough to, but I thought, well, shit, if this is the last time I'm going to see him, I'm going to ask him, what's Bob Dylan like? And he said, you know what? Bob Dylan is the funniest guy you'll ever meet. You wouldn't think that, but he's a really funny guy to hang out with. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Kind of changed my perspective. It's not just, the obvious stuff. The humor is there, in between the lines, or sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not so obvious. So I think my guess would be with this book was he was trying to have some fun, rather than, writing another memoir would be serious business. Not that it couldn't have humor in it, but it people were, after the bar he set with Chronicles, people were expecting, a big, important, word from on high from Bob Dylan. This is lighter and more fun, and it's a great Christmas gift. It's even, it's got that gift book shape and lots of illustrations, and it's easy. It's that bathroom read, short, pithy chapters. So I think, he was having fun with the rubric he was working within, and that would be my guess. But who knows, right? That's a tough question to answer. Sorry.
Yeah.
I punted that one a little bit.
But I like what you said. I like what you said, though. I mean, sometimes the most simple explanation is, in fact, it's like, because I wanted to, because it was fun,
Yeah.
Enjoyable. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he thanks the crew from Dunkin' Donuts. I mean,
Right.
you're, right off the bat that he's, it's not a weighty, serious excursion into, and I think that's part of it too, like the philosophy of modern song. That's got to be tongue in cheek, right? I mean, that's got to be. So if you're taking everything as you read, and then you get, the dedication and the thank yous to crew at Dunkin' Donuts, you're like, okay, he's having fun here, and he's not poking fun at us. He's having a good time doing this. So that's kind of what I meant.
I would really like to get your thoughts on this. It occurred to me, the song Murder Most Foul is, it's a really interesting song, kind of juxtaposing these two things, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and then a list of songs. And here we are about 2 years later. There's this list of songs.
Yeah.
Now, I know people, somebody's going to nail me for quit trying to find meanings in things, but is it possible there's some kind of greater message, something about the importance of songs? I mean, in the song, it's like, there's no request. It's play this song, play this song, play this song. What do you think?
Huh. Yeah, I mean, you have to imagine that Bob Dylan is aware of how seriously we take everything he says.
Right.
And for better or worse, I'm sure there are days when he's not all that comfortable with how seriously we take every utterance from Bob Dylan. But I do think, and I touched on this before when I was talking about Warren Zevon, I think there are people in here, like Dion, for instance. He ends with Dion. He clearly wanted to remind us that Dion is probably greater than we remember him, Similarly with Warren Zevon and some of the other writers. And there are detours in the book to songs that are lighter or more humorous, or maybe that we shouldn't elevate. He kind of says, this it's not that this is a great song, it's just a song worth talking about, right? So and that could just be the way I read it, but that's certainly what I took away from some of them. But I've got to imagine Bob Dylan is a relatively self-aware guy. I think he knows when he's giving us a list of 66 songs, it's not going to be just the 66 that are on it, but the 60,000 that aren't. Right. And I think that's important too. And the whys, for each of them. And I would go one further than you and add to Murder Most Foul Theme Time Radio Hour, because those songs were obviously curated. I mean, those are songs that, certainly not every song was like Bob Dylan's favorite song in the world, but there were again detours into old America or old pop culture that he wanted us to remember, that he wanted us to listen to and think about. And I think that's certainly how I took Murder Most Foul. There's a lot to chew on in that. And I think the same thing with the book. It's, sure, you can, like I said jokingly, you can use it as a bathroom read, or you can sit down and really dissect it. You could teach a songwriting course about this, or even, maybe a semester of Bob Dylan studies could be built just around the book and the whys and the why nots and the list and the ones that didn't make it, and his contemporaries who aren't mentioned and those who are, the people who inspired him. There's a lot of, somebody pointed out in a review that the majority of the songs come from the year when Bob was 15 years old. And I think that's fascinating. There's like a third of the song come from the mid 50s when he was a teenager. I think that's there's something about Bob's origin story there that, I don't think that it's something he's trying to tell us, but I think it does tell us something. I'm not sure what it is yet, but I think it's there.
Kind of a side note, there's a couple of connections between Bob Dylan and the late Jerry Lee Lewis. And you were mentioning some of the old originators of rock and roll. I'm curious, did you ever encounter Jerry Lee Lewis or interview him?
I never interviewed Jerry Lee Lewis. I saw him once at a show here. I believe he did a two-for show with Little Richard. This is maybe 10 or 15 years ago here in New York City at a relatively small place. I think it was at BB King's in Midtown. He was an older, calmer Jerry Lee, but he was ornery. He was giving the band shit, and he was tough. I mean, he was a tough guy. I'm trying. It's a long time ago, and I didn't expect the question. So
yeah, it was out of nowhere.
But that's okay. Look, Jerry Lee. It was funny. My daughter, when he died, my daughter texted me and said, "I know I should know who this guy is, but I don't really remember you ever playing him in the house." And I thought, "Wow, it's really interesting." And she's kind of right, because I'm more, my top tier is always Richard and Chuck Berry and, Roy Orbison. Then you get to Johnny Cash, Waylon, Willie, Chris Christopherson, there's kind of but let's stick with the Sun people, Carl Perkins,
right.
That sort of, those are those are the people I would pull out on any day and listen to the whole record. Buddy Holly's another one, the Everlys are another one, because they were certainly crucial in the next phase of rock and roll. Eddie Cochran, and we were joking about this because, the list gets pretty long. Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent, I haven't even really thought about Jerry Lee yet. But if you just have those two songs, Whole Lot of Shakin' and Great Balls of Fire, he was immortal then. That set him in the history of rock and roll. The thing is, he made many records after that for Sun, in the early 70s that were great records. The thing, like especially Carl Perkins, that Jerry Lee did was he added the country to rock and roll, in a way that some of the black artists were more, they added the R&B to rock and roll. And I think it was really, not that they didn't have country in them, but they had a country blues, whereas Jerry Lee added like real roots country. And so I think, he's really important. He's certainly important to Bob Dylan. You can hear anything up tempo Bob does, but even in the mid 60s, more country tinged albums, there's much more Jerry Lee in those records than there is Carl Perkins or Johnny Cash, even though he loved Johnny and Johnny was around at the time. If you really listen, you can hear latter day or, sort of mid period Jerry Lee as opposed to the Sun Records Jerry Lee. People are going to correct me. I'm talking about sort of, mid 60s, early 70s Jerry Lee, when he got back with Sun Records and was making good albums again after he'd been sort of persona non grata in the music business for a while, for obvious reasons. The other thing is Jerry Lee's iconoclastic in a way that I think Bob Dylan and people like Bob, Chuck, Keith Richards, people like that can really identify with. He absolutely did things his own way and was unapologetic. He did not care what you thought about him marrying his 14-year-old cousin. Fuck you. I mean, that was really his attitude.
Yeah.
And we all have opinions on that. And certainly it's not a good look. I mean, that was the thing, there was an interview, the LA Times did a piece with his 14-year-old bride, who's now a woman in her 70s. And that was what my daughters picked up on.
Right.
They were like, wow, because they love Richard and they love Chuck Berry, they know him from around the house and all that. But they were like, wow, this is out there. In 2022, that's bonkers. And so it's, Bob mentioned him on the stage the other night and, paid tribute to him, played a song. I think that's important because it reminds us that Jerry Lee wasn't just the tabloid fodder.
Right.
He was a guy, he was a flesh and blood guy, obviously, but his music is immortal, and that's what Bob said. Jerry Lee is going to live forever. We all know that. And it's true. It's just, it's a complicated legacy, much more than, sort of Buddies or even Richard or Chuck Berry, a very complicated legacies.
So I always like to let my guests just take the microphone at the end. There's Bob Dylan fans all over the world. And as you pointed out, they're very quick to respond to anything new. So what would you say to anybody who has tuned in with us?
Well, that's an open question. Related to what? Related to Bob Dylan? Related to the future?
Yeah,
related to
maybe related to Dylan in this book.
Sure. Look, I think we're lucky to have this book. I've read mostly positive reviews, some reviews that were a little, flummoxed by the book. Others that, there were one or two that really disliked it or pointed out things that they took issue with, whatever. You got to remember, Bob Dylan is almost 82 years old. He's 81 and a half. We're really fortunate to be in a world where Bob Dylan is still creating at a level that is, most of his contemporaries have long since given up making new music. He's not only making new music, he's making great new music, music that stands up against some of his best work and is certainly a more evolved and mature version of the Bob Dylan we love. So that he's writing books. He's not writing like children's books for the money, or, graphic novels, the history of, he's writing something that is, not, I wouldn't say serious necessarily, but, something that we can really dig into over time and get something from is really a gift that I think many of us take for granted on a day-to-day basis. We debate him online, we bitch at each other on social media. I know the date. No, you know the date. No, it's this version. It's that version. It's this lyric. No, he did. It's like all of that is fun and entertaining, but, set aside your judgment and your one-upsmanship for a moment and revel in the idea that Bob Dylan is still walking the earth amongst us and is imparting new music on us and new projects on us. There's, a film in the works, and there's this book, and there'll probably be another Chronicles at some point down the road. And I think, that for us not to appreciate that in full measure would be remiss. We'd be remiss. How's that? I scolded Dylanologists.
You did great. You did great.
Okay.
Well, Jeff Slate, I want everybody out there, check out jeffslatehq.com. Some great music. Great music. Thank you. I really like Letter from Paris.
Thank you.
Great song. Really enjoyed it. But you came highly recommended by Bob Dylan Music Company. And so that means something, I think. You really delivered in this interview. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your thoughts on the book.
I'm glad you said that at the end and not the beginning. It would have set me up to fail if you'd said you came highly recommended by Bob's office. That's like the kiss of death for any interview. But I appreciate. I have a long relationship with Bob's team, and it's a great team. I've been able to do some work for them. They're always a pleasure to work for. But that they ever recommend me for stuff like this is a thrill and an honor. So I appreciate the soapbox, so to speak.
Well. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And if I can ever be of service, please don't hesitate.
I'm sure there'll be a record coming out down the road when you'll be called on.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thanks a lot.
All right, sir.
The Paul Leslie Hour is made possible by people like you, listeners, viewers. Please go to thepaulleslie.com/support. And you'll know what to do when you're there. Thank you. Thank you, everyone who contributes. Performance of The Entertainer intro song by John Primorano. And of course, this is your announcer speaking. See you next time on the Paul Leslie Hour.